My name is Sophie Ibbotson. I'm the chairman of the RSAA, and I'm very, very happy to be inviting our speaker, Sherzod Muminov, with us this evening to talk about his new book, 11 Winters of Discontent, the Siberian Internment and the Making of New Japan. In the almost 125-year history of the RSAA, it is rare that we have a first, but I'm pretty sure that we've never before had a speaker addressing the fascinating topic of the Siberian internment of Japanese POWs and its impact on the making of post-war Japan. One of the things that I love about the Reading Room series is that we can delve into some of the less well-known aspects of Asian history, culture, and politics through the book, speaking directly to the authors, and this is a truly enriching experience. Dr. Sherzod Muminov is a multilingual historian working with sources in Japanese and Russian. He also speaks Turkish and English. He received his PhD in East Asian Studies from the University of Cambridge, where he was also a postdoctoral research associate in the ERC project, The Dissolution of the Japanese Empire and the Struggle for Legitimacy in Post-War East Asia. At that time, he taught courses in modern Japanese and East Asian history. Sherzod's primary research is in modern Japanese and East Asian history, Japanese, Soviet and Russian relations, the Cold War in East Asia, the post-World War II post-imperial migrations in East Asia, and the international and transnational history of the Soviet system of forced labor camps for prisoners of war. Today, he is Associate Professor in Japanese History at the University of East Anglia, and 11 Winters of Discontent, which was published by Harvard University Press, is his first book. Those of you who've joined us for this event before will be familiar with the format. The speaker will introduce the book for about 15 minutes. I will then take chair's privilege to ask him a series of questions, and then we will open it up to questions from the floor. Dr. Muminov, please join us to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming this afternoon. I would like to thank RSAA for this wonderful opportunity, for this honor and pleasure to speak to you all about my book, and Sophie personally for reaching out to me with this idea. So thank you. So the title of the book is, as Sophie very kindly introduced, 11 Winters of Discontent, the Siberian Internment and the Making of a New Japan, which also is the title of this presentation. I will not talk too much. I will mostly, the reason why I made the slides is mostly to show images and maps and maybe outline some of the points about the book. So the book was published over 2 years ago in January 2022. It has been awarded the Hall Prize quite unexpectedly. I was actually this year thinking that probably 2 years, and since it's my first book, as Sophie mentioned, I didn't know what to expect. But I was quite gobsmacked, actually, if I'm honest, to receive this prize from the Association for Asian Studies. It's a book that has been that came into a field that has been quite not really well researched. So the Siberian internment, as I will tell you what it is, and some facts about the event and its legacies, its importance. But Siberian internment, in English especially, has not really been researched, which is one of the reasons why I decided to research this as a PhD dissertation. So the book is based on my Cambridge PhD dissertation in East Asian Studies. So on the slide, I will also briefly outline the presentation. So I will start by talking about the internment itself. So what was the Siberian internment, its origins and facts. And then I will talk about Japanese experiences in Soviet POW camps using photographs. Some of them are quite rare, previously unseen photographs from the archives or from propaganda albums, just to provide a glimpse of life, what life was like for these POWs within the Soviet system of camps. I will, if time allows, also place their experience in the broader context of the camp. So maybe compare those experiences with those of other POWs, including Axis POWs, Germans, Italians, Austrians, and the like. I will specifically focus on the so-called Siberian Trinity of Suffering. Then I will talk about the so-called democratic movement. So that was one of the names by which the POWs themselves referred to this propaganda education and indoctrination, if you like, program. Although it wasn't simply just that, it wasn't just a top-down program that was spoon-fed by the camp political officers. It was, I think, as the name suggests, it was more of a movement that was a product of collaboration, or product of some kind of a marriage of convenience between, on one hand, the Soviet propaganda officers, and on the other hand, the Japanese themselves. And finally, I will also talk about what happened when my protagonists went back to Japan. That one of the arguments of the book is that the struggles, the troubles, did not end with their long-awaited repatriation home. So when they came home, it wasn't all, all good for them. It wasn't just the return to normal life, which they really hoped for. So there were some struggles awaiting back in post-war Japan. So if we start by asking what was the Siberian internment, so I have this map, which is a Soviet military map of what is known as Manchuria, unofficially I think known as Manchuria, which in this case we're talking about three northeastern Chinese provinces, the area that the Chinese refer as Dongbei, and you can see the last months of the war. This is a map of the Soviet Manchurian offensive, and these were probably among the last land battles of Second World War. We are talking August 8th Moscow time, 9th Tokyo time, when the Soviet Union joins the Allied effort against Japan, despite having actually a non-aggression pact with Japan, neutrality pact with Japan at the time. So the red arrows, these are the Soviet forces coming in from three directions, from the north, west, and the east, and they're moving at lightning speed, and they found the Japanese Kwantung Army that was there to defend the puppet kingdom of Manchukuo, completely outgunned, completely surprised. The Japanese strategy was war of attrition, but it becomes soon it becomes very clear that they had completely miscalculated it, and the Soviets basically take this very big area in under 2 weeks. So that was quite an impressive feat, a military feat. It was obviously an operation that was well planned by the Soviets. So 9th of August, you have the Manchurian strategic offensive, and then 16th of August, there is a document in the Soviet archives that basically rules out that any Japanese POWs would be taken to Soviet territory. And this is one of the interesting things, because it kind of misleads us. When you see that document, 16th of August, you start believing that Soviets had no designs or no plans to take any Japanese to the Soviet Union. On the 19th of August, Japanese forces formalized their surrender in a meeting in the Maritime province. However, 1 week after that 16th of August document, on the 23rd of August, completely out of the blue, Stalin orders transporting, quote, 500,000 Japanese POWs fit to work in the conditions of Siberia and the Far East to the Soviet Union. So even the officers on the ground were surprised by this kind of U-turn, because something happened within that 1 week. We will not know for sure what exactly happened. There are several theories, and in the absence of definitive documents, which are still secret in Moscow archives. We will never know. So some historians believe that this was all premeditated, that Stalin knew that he would take the Japanese. Other historians say that he became quite angry with Truman, who actually denied him landing Soviet troops on Japan proper, and made a U-turn, and that he hadn't been planning that. One day we will find out, I guess. But from then on, the Japanese were put in these cattle cars. On the left, you have one of those in a museum. On the right, you have the Japanese impressions of a survivor, Kyuchinobu, actually, how he described the journey. Obviously, not everybody went by rail. Some people who were surrendered close to the border, actually marched across the border. Some people were put on boats. So it wasn't not all of them were traveling by train. But then all of them, I think, were completely in the dark, because when they were boarding the trains, Soviet guards didn't tell them that they were being taken to the Soviet Union. Some of them actually had to look at the stars and realize that they are being moved north for some reason, whereas, Japan would be, if you were going to Japan, you would be moving south and east, but they realized they were going actually north and west. So when they arrived, they were likely to see something like this, the gates of the camp. So this is from a very rare album from the State Archive of the Russian Federation. This was, however, an unusual camp, because as you can see on this image, it was a summer camp and it was a transit camp. But I'm showing these photographs because they are probably among the very rare few photographs that have survived of any camps, because at the time, these photographs were taken for accounting purposes, just to show the bosses in Moscow how tidy everything is, how everything is well organized, etc. And again, going back to Kyuchinobu, this image is probably a closer to reality kind of image of what a camp would look like. But of course, they were very diverse. There were over 2,000 camp units where the Japanese stayed. So they stayed for some time, and this is the map from the book. They stayed anywhere from a few months to 11 years. Those who stayed 11 years were actually those who had been convicted in Soviet courts or secret courts for war crimes, but the majority stayed roughly anywhere from a few months to 4 years. So most of the POWs had been returned to the Soviet Union by the end of the 1940s. And they were quite an important injection of labor force. So they worked in railway construction. So if you look here, just under this railway like car sign, there's this line, which is BAM, Baikal-Amur Main Line. So the Japanese worked there. They worked in mining and in logging, in fisheries, agriculture, urban construction. One of the, I think Sophie will know this, one of the buildings that they built, or that was built with their labor, was this Navoi Theater in Tashkent, where I come from, and lots of other buildings, obviously. So the Siberian Trinity of Suffering is something that comes up quite a lot in their memoirs. So one of the first suffering was work. Of course, everything revolved around work. These images obviously are all staged. Not everybody worked indoors. A lot of the work was outside in very cold conditions. So logging was quite a popular activity for. Popular not in the sense that POWs really liked them, but popular for the Soviet captors to use POW labor, etc. The second suffering in the Trinity, probably I should have put this first. It was cold, and I don't think this requires a lot of explanation. So the areas where the Japanese were interned were mostly very cold places. So again, going back to Kyuchinobu's kind of cartoon manga-like paintings, he says our war comrade has died and our tears turn into icicles. And this is what the Russians call vatnik. So it's like a padded coat that was ubiquitous in the Gulag, that everybody wore because they were quite warm and they lasted quite long. And the final suffering in the Trinity is the food or lack thereof. In the first 2 years of the internment, the food situation was actually dire in the camps. It was dire throughout the Soviet Union. And from these images, we can see that food was an absolutely most important concern. You can see the smile on the face of this guy who just looks at the bread and he can't really hide his happiness. Democratic movement. So rare images again from the archives, and this one on the right is from a private collection which now is in a museum in Tokyo. So the Soviets selected several from each camp, from each group of POWs, several people who were quite sympathetic to socialism or Marxism, or who had a history of Marxism, and who then became activists. And these activists would act as a very important link between the POW body on one hand and the Soviet political officers on the other. You can see the political officer here. They would actually play an important role in producing all kinds of propaganda material. So I think here they're looking at wall newspapers. You can see a poster which was clearly decorated by a Japanese, artistically inclined Japanese. But of course, the main vehicle of the propaganda was the Japan newspaper, which was edited by the Japanese, by an editorial team of Japanese, and which was the main vehicle of not only announcements, but also of all kinds of propaganda, translations from Soviet newspapers, criticism of what's happening in Japan at the time, US occupation, etc. So I know my time is coming to an end, so I will wrap up by talking about what happened towards the end of when the long-awaited return home materialized. So you can see these on these pictures, you have the POWs actually boarding the repatriation ships, which had been sent by the US occupation administration. And here you can see them actually coming to Japan, just about to disembark. However, what awaited them in Japan was not always a very warm welcome. So towards the end of the 40s, there were so-called recalcitrant repatriates, people who had become, if you like, Marxist, or who had been persuaded by the Soviet way of life, and who refused to cooperate, who actually created trouble when they landed. And this made the first pages of newspapers, not only in Japan, but also everywhere else. As you can see in this Life magazine from July 1949, you have headlines such as "Japan's Red Army Gets Back Home." And obviously there were a few, say, of these troublemakers, but the image of this red repatriate coming back to Japan and who will be ready to stage a revolution at the flick of Stalin's finger is this kind of sensationalist message that prevails or dominates the newspapers and publications at the time, which in a way kind of impacts the reception of the POWs. They are sidelined for most of post-war Japanese history. They are, when they request initially and then demand compensations for their captivity, for their service, for their inadvertent service to the nation, they are almost always ignored, and they are their pleas, their demands for compensation and recognition are only answered in the 2010s. I think in 2010, the year 2010, with a change of government. So the brief window in which Democratic Party of Japan actually ruled the country for very briefly, taking over from the long-running kind of dominant power of LDP. And I argue in the book that this was not because the Japanese state recognized their service, but because these guys, these old soldiers here, you can see them sitting in front of the Japanese National Diet. They were quite advanced in age, and it was out of deference, I think, for their age. And as Hiratsuka Mitsuo, who was the chairman of the All Japan Council for compensation, said, "We are fighting to reclaim our dignity as human beings. Only slaves are put to work without being paid." So that is the end of my brief, kind of very maybe abrupt, disjointed introduction to the book. Sorry, I took longer than 15 minutes, but I will be very happy to have your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherzod, for that excellent introduction, and also for the very evocative photographs and informative maps as well. During your talk, you mentioned about the kind of labor that the internees were put to. But I recall in the book, you said actually the cost to the Soviet Union of hosting and looking after the internees actually was equal to or outweighed the value of the labor that they got. Was it just that it hadn't been thought through? Were they there primarily as a labor force, or were there other reasons that the Soviet Union wanted to have the prisoners of war in Siberia for an extended period when they could have sent them home?
Thank you. Great question. And it's a very complex question, Sophie. I tried to do justice to the complexity in the book. It's for you to judge if I've managed to do that. But we have to put all of this into broader context of forced labor in the Soviet Union. I think the topic that many of you will be familiar with the history of the Gulag. And overall, I think the historians' consensus is that it was never, at least in monetary terms, at least in financial terms, it was never viable or profitable. So Soviet Union's economic model, or especially the so-called penal economy of the Soviet Union, was built on slightly different premises than, for example, Western capitalist models. So Soviets didn't really much care about making any profit in most cases, although every document that you read from the Gulag, every document that you read from Moscow, for example, that is sent to the local chiefs of camps, they demand that camps actually kind of justify their costs. So that is one thing that we need to take into account. Soviets actually rarely got, at least financially, in financial terms, rarely got what they invested in all of this. But I think there's another bigger context that we need to put the Japanese labor in is the labor not only of any captives in the Soviet system, including Soviet citizens, but the labor of POWs. And the Japanese were the second largest group. And I didn't have time in my introduction to mention this, but there were anywhere between 3 million to 4 million, depending on when you look at, towards the end of the war, Axis POWs in the Soviet Union. So you have the Germans, who are the biggest group, so over 2 million Germans. And then the Japanese, there were the Hungarians, Austrians. So the labor of the POWs is, I argue, is not as important, or is not the primary justification for keeping them in the Soviet Union, because there are other considerations. And perhaps the most important consideration here is obviously these people, and I don't want to oversimplify their value to the Soviet Union, but these people are hostages. These people are, and they are used when renegotiating Soviet Union's post-war relations with their home countries. They are used as bargaining chips. They are used as, if you like, they help Soviet Union negotiate from a position of power. So on one hand, you have obviously the need for labor, but I don't think that we should judge the need for labor clearly in the terms of will we get the return that we are investing, but from also the viewpoint of hands. So Soviet Union's economic condition, or Soviet Union's overall condition of Soviet economy, was completely devastated in the war. And one of the simple facts was that you needed hands, even for very crude labor, even for very crude activities with very crude tools. And the Japanese, in their memoirs, write about that the crude nature of Soviet methods. That they talk about how the Japanese would really be surprised that they had nothing but say spades, or they had nothing but axes. So the condition of the economy was such that even having someone to lend a hand, quite literally, was quite important. So several factors. I hope I didn't confuse you more than I clarified this, but I think there is that economic rationale there, at least in the sense that in these various reading groups or lectures or propaganda sessions, the POWs themselves are told in no uncertain terms that your country has come and devastated. I mean, this didn't really work in the Japanese case. It worked more in the German case, or in European Axis POWs whose armies had come into the Soviet Union and actually caused devastation, let alone human victims of the war. The Japanese had never invaded the Soviet Union, but they were also, of course, then shoehorned into this big group of Axis POWs, who I believe, and I make this point in the book to summarize, really, Stalin needed to keep for some future use. In the meantime, they were just put to work.
Thank you. That makes an awful lot of sense. You mentioned that there were a number of different POW groups and other incarcerated groups within the Soviet Union at the same time. How typical was the Japanese experience in those camps? Were they treated in much the same way as any other POWs, or was there a particular characteristic to the camps that they were in, the sorts of work that they were doing?
Again, another great question. Thank you, Sophie. I think if we compare, again, if we look at the Japanese as just following the clear and very obvious distinction of them being foreigners, and then you have several million Soviet POWs in the Gulag. And this is why I argue that we shouldn't really say the Japanese were in the Gulag, because I mean, the small letter Gulag, yes, makes sense, because small letter Gulag means a labor camp. But the big Gulag, the big letter Gulag system was quite different, although the POW camps had been built using the expertise and using the experience of the Gulag system itself. So if we follow that distinction and we say, on one hand, you have the Soviet citizens who we put aside for now, and then you have the big group of foreign POWs. And within that big group of foreign POWs, of course, the experiences also varied. And one thing I did not expect to find when I started this PhD dissertation and later the book was that because if you come into this, before you go to the archives, if you come into the topic, as I did, from the Japanese side, and I read a lot of Japanese memoirs while I waited to go to Moscow. And the Japanese viewpoint is they were victims, which they were, of course. I'm not diminishing the victimhood. They were treated horribly. It was illegal. Soviet Union was an illegal, was breaking international law, which all of that is true. But when you look into the archives, and with each document, I was really surprised. There is clearly very kind of surprising amount of care that the Soviets are showing these foreigners. So it's even as the war is still going on, years before the Japanese come into this, there are many orders that the Soviet military and political leadership actually issue, which says you should not let these POWs die. Why? Because yes, I mean, in the future they could be used as bargaining chips, they could be used as labor force, but it was also, we shouldn't forget, really bad publicity for the Soviet Union after the war ended, especially when every power, every allied power Britain, US, they all obviously are upholding the Potsdam Declaration, where they say, well, Article 9 of Potsdam Declaration says after the hostilities end, POWs should be allowed to return to their home countries. I mean, obviously, British are also using some POWs in Southeast Asia, some Japanese POWs in Southeast Asia, but not at the scale as the Soviet Union, because Soviet Union is just sitting on these people and not letting them go, despite very strong objections in the UN and in every other international forum. So my answer is again becoming too long, but within that foreign POW experience of labor, I found, and I make this argument in the book, the Japanese was the least bad. And that was something really surprised me. And there are too many instances or too many proofs, evidence, archival evidence of this, and memoiristic evidence of this, in the sense that yes, their captivity was illegal. Yes, they shouldn't have been there. Yes, the Soviet Union had kept them illegally and should have let them go. But compared to Germans and Italians, their life wasn't as bad. Or at least Soviets showed more care to the Japanese, partly because I think Germans were always the main enemy, and Soviet history is full of, even if you look at propaganda posters made during the war, the Germans were the existential enemy. The Soviet posters actually encouraging people to kill Germans, like, as if they were not human. So there was no such hatred towards the Japanese. There was always propaganda against the Japanese. Japan was always a rival, even going back to the imperial times. Imperial Russia and Japan had always been kind of fighting for the Far East, if you like, to oversimplify things. But you can't really compare the amount or the level of negativity attached to the Japanese. Even the Japanese themselves, when you read the memoirs, they say, the guard told me that Germans should be like, always watch a German. Like, you can't really let a German like unwatched even for a minute, because they will cook something up. And then I asked, he says, what about us, the Japanese? We're Asian. So I guess he was kind of trying to push the Soviet to tell them if like race comes into it, and the Russians say, no, I don't care about you. You are little guys. Obviously race comes into it, like inadvertent racism there. Oh, you're a little Asian guy. But there is also the idea that these guys are not really seen as the real enemy. So I guess that conditions the treatment in a way, both the treatment, labor treatment, but also overall treatment.
Thank you. I've got one more question, but if anybody in the audience wants to ask Sherzod a question, please send it to me on the chat box at the bottom of your screens, and I will then move on to those questions. In terms of the propaganda that we've been discussing, I'm very interested in the impact that the Soviet propaganda had on the internees themselves. How effective do you think it was at changing the views of the individuals who were incarcerated, but also when they did ultimately return home to Japan, were they able to, or did they influence Japanese society with the new ideas that they'd received in the Soviet Union?
Thanks. Wonderful question again. Short answer, not really. So much as at the time in occupied Japan, this is Allied occupation period in Japan. So we're talking 1945 to 52. When Japan is occupied by the United States, and Japanese history, or Japanese, if you like, the whole post-war period is mainly or largely shaped by this period, in which the Americans, obviously the Cold War is heating up, 1947, 1948, all the things, global context of the Cold War, we know, confrontation after confrontation in Berlin and over Greece and Turkey, etc., the founding of NATO, etc. So the American effort is to turn Japan into an ally, to make sure that Japan remains firmly in the Western camp. And the Soviets have this very precious for them, again, to look at it from the Soviet perspective, a very precious resource. These are not just bodies of people who you can use as a source of labor, which they do, of course. These are not also only bargaining chips who you can trade for something in the future, which they eventually do in normalizing diplomatic relations in 1956. And one of the things that the Japanese side, even before they start their negotiations in London, the first thing they demand is you need to let our people return home. But in addition to all of this, obviously, you can exploit the minds of these people. So while Siberian Internment is about the bodily experiences, so what I've read close to 100 of these memoirs that the returnees have written, and most of what they remember is, and again, goes back to the Siberian Trinity of suffering. It's about bodily experience, about being cold, being hungry, being tired from the work. But they normally don't emphasize the democratic movement. And this is understandable because most of these memoirs were written during the Cold War, and you didn't want to really talk about this. You didn't really want to emphasize the fact that you came back from a communist country, that you underwent this kind of indoctrination. But portraying this simply as indoctrination is also misleading because there was clearly political will or political consciousness among the POWs themselves, which actually this consciousness goes back to the tyranny of the officers in the Imperial Japanese Army. And Imperial Japanese Army was always known for brutality of the officer class towards the men, that daily beatings were quite common, that regardless of age, draftees or even non-coms were really treated with a disdain and with with brutality, with daily brutality. So when the Soviets sensed this, initially the Soviet approach to managing the Japanese POW body was delegate. So the Soviets didn't have the resources. They didn't also have people who could speak the language, who could really communicate with the Japanese. So for the Soviets, it was really easy to just say, okay, who are the officers? Okay, these are the officers, and tell the officers, okay, you take care of your men, you make sure that they don't make trouble, and we guarantee certain things for you, which meant that in the initial months, the tyranny continues. Obviously, the officers who had been used to this kind of behavior, who use the soldiers, the draftees, in their own interest, in their own kind of to enforce their own power. They continue to do that. But then Soviets realize very cleverly that there is clearly something here. The divide and rule can be applied in the sense that you can give power to the disenfranchised or the disempowered, who are, in this case, of course, we're talking about the draftees. And of course, that also kind of fits nicely in with the Soviet idea of, which goes back to the Soviet kind of idea of the soldiers and the proletarians and the peasants actually overthrowing their lords. So this long-winded answer, but basically the origins of democratic movement are not simply Soviets dispensing wisdom and communist knowledge. It's also, there is clearly some upswelling of anger at the officers, which is then, of course, put to good use to create a kind of a mutual, if you like, activity or mutual movement in which several of these left-leaning, from each group, left-leaning POWs are given powers, which could often trump officers' powers. So officer tyranny is nipped in the bud by the Soviets. And this power is, I argue also in the book, is, that makes some people drunk with power, because the people who had been constantly beaten and disdained on a daily basis suddenly find themselves in a very interesting laboratory. Basically, the beginning of the Cold War within the camps, even before they returned to Japan, where they can exercise this newfound power, and which leads, of course, to these activists at least becoming very kind of militant and very quite to buy the idea. However, again, going back to your original question, when they returned to Japan, there is not much impact, partly because the activists were in the minority, but even those who had become convinced in the Soviet way, and even those who believed that that Japan should become a workers' paradise and should emulate the Soviet Union, should become a proletarian nation, those once once the ships leave the Soviet harbor, opportunists, all of them obviously dropped their Soviet ideology, but even the really diehard ones whose number is growing towards the end of the internment, because the longer they spend in the Soviet Union, the more exposed they are, and the stronger their true belief, because not only are they reading in the newspapers or at reading clubs, but they're also witnessing. They're allowed to leave the camp. They're allowed to walk and for example, interact with the local populations, and they can see for themselves that the changes are there. So even they, I mean, minority as they in the minority as they are, they come to Japan and they realize that what the Soviets had been telling them about Japan wasn't always true, that Soviet propaganda was actually completely misrepresenting what was going on in Japan. And when they come, many of them embrace their Japaneseness or re-embrace their Japaneseness. So there are some people who make trouble. So this both images are from the book. So on the right, you have this fellow who apparently is trying to join a demonstration, a communist demonstration at the square where they land in the city of Maizuru, and being constrained by probably a family member in a kimono and an official who looks Southeast Asian to me, probably one of those Filipino officers who were as part of the Allied occupation in Japan. But these were in the minority, and these were either kind of intimidated into dropping their allegiance, or because there was clearly discrimination against them. When they came back, they really struggled, many of them, even those who had not been militant, who hadn't done anything, who hadn't really taken part in any kind of trouble. They found that it's very difficult for them to find jobs, to find marriage candidates, marriage partners. And the press was not only Japanese, but also, as we see in the American press, was quite trigger happy, in the sense that they were quite happy to label these people, oh, they're all red. So it wasn't an easy life. So soon after they returned, maybe very few of them would join the JCP. A lot joined the JCP, but not many actually did anything or stayed in the JCP. Some of them, quite a few of them actually joined soon after returning to Japan, but only a few would remain or would rise through the ranks of the JCP. So in the book, I also say that their impact on Cold War society on the side of communism was negligible. Sorry again for a long answer.
No, it's absolutely fascinating, and I really appreciate the detail that you're going into. I've been sent 2 questions on the chat box, which are about the internees' experiences once they returned to Japan. And I'm going to ask them to you together, because I think there is probably some overlap in your response. The first question is, given that the Americans were occupying Japan in the 1950s, when the prisoners of war returned, did the Americans view them as a threat, as a communist threat? And were they monitoring or controlling them in any way once they returned to Japan? And the second question, also about the returnees, was how different did they find Japan when they came back compared to what they had left 11 years before and before the war? Did they find themselves unable to fit into the culture and the country they'd returned to? So I suppose it comes down to they had changed, the country had changed, and how big an impact did that have?
Thank you. Fascinating two questions. So the first question, the Americans, surprisingly, and this is another surprise in the research, while all the newspapers were publishing these headlines about, on one hand, China and the Soviet Union. So if you look at newspapers in this period, late 40s, early 50s, understandably, the Cold War is heating up. In 1950, in June, you have the Korean War that starts. So that adds to, oil to the fire, fuel to the fire. And the press and the Japanese public is quite rightly, I guess, worried about Japan being the next domino, that Japan might be invaded. So the North Korea invaded South Korea, and initially North Korea was doing quite well. So there was a lot of alarmism on the side of the public, on the side of the newspapers, the press. But the surprise for me was I also read all of the declassified American reports of the time on this topic. So CIA reports, national intelligence estimates, NIEs, British reports also in the Q archives. And very few of those documents are really alarmed. So they of course talk about the problem. They mention some of them being because many of these starting with, I think, in 47 especially, but even from the very first returnees in 46, they were interrogated. So they were interrogation rooms in the repatriation center in Maizuru on the Sea of Japan coast. And a lot of these people would be taken in by the Allies. Often the translators would be the Japanese American soldiers or Nisei soldiers, and they would be asked very specific questions. So the initial ones, the ones who came, they were quite naive. They were quite happy to be back alive because in the camps they had never been sure that they one day would again walk on Japanese soil. And when they come, they give out, they tell them everything they know. But later on, the recalcitrant ones, the ones that are more sympathetic to the Soviet Union than especially to America, their protest is like every question they respond, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. But the Americans had a very good body of intelligence, including intelligence as in which camp were you in, which locality was it, how far was the train station, how many guards, all of that kind of question, like intelligence that they gathered using the Japanese. So I think based on that massive body of intelligence gathered, on the other, in Europe, they were also, of course, gathering lots of intelligence. Those of you who are interested, you can look up Project Ringer, WRINGER, and Project Stitch. So those projects are the projects by which the American occupation forces, both in Japan and in Europe, are gathering intelligence material about the Soviet Union from the POWs coming back to their home countries. And the reports go back to the reports I've read. None of those reports are alarmist. They are quite calm. They're quite, yes, these people are coming back. Yes, they are displaying some belligerency. Or they don't really demonstrate any kind of significant alarm. So what they talk about is these people haven't been at home. They have been heavily brainwashed. They have been misled, and this is the language that they use. They have been given wrong information about the conditions in Japan, which kind of will help me segue into the second question. And they will come round. They will go back home. They will return to their communities. They do mention, and when I say they do, I should correct myself because the reports don't mention this, but Japanese government reports of agencies that are responsible for reintegration of the people, for providing assistance, for providing not only monetary assistance, but also other kinds of support, welfare support. Usually they would be the agencies dealing with this would be the local government, local councils, welfare departments most of the time, who would, for example, help them find a job, or who would usually, if they had been working in private sphere, they would often be restored just as a gesture of goodwill. They would be restored in their positions if they had been, or if they had some kind of experience, in any industry. So those agencies would emphasize in their documents that we need to really pay attention to the reintegration and we need to provide the support. So they don't say um, or else, obviously, but the or else is kind of, you could guess that or else they might actually become angry, become disillusioned, and that would make them more communist. So I don't know if this answers the question. I don't think that the U.S. occupation were convinced that they were a communist threat. They did watch them. In some cases they watched them individually, but I think they were deemed not as a significant threat that would cause any kind of trouble. So the Frank Gibney, who was this American Cold War correspondent who wrote the words of this Life article that on the left. He also wrote a book, and in the book he uses very colorful metaphors. So he talks about tomatoes. So I don't know. Can you guess what he means by tomato? So he says that these POWs came back, and we thought they were all tomatoes, which means like they were red outside and in, that they were really true reds. They had been convinced by the Soviets, but then it turns out that they're actually radishes. That they're only red outside and they're white inside. So it was easy to reintegrate them and to convince them that they had been really wrong about Japan, and they had been wrong about the situation, which leads me to the second question. They were really surprised when they came back. So many of them had left. If we talk about the average Japanese POW who ended up in the Soviet Union, an average POW would come back around 48, 49. That was the year. So even the shortest time they spent would be something like 5 years. Say they were drafted in the last year of the war in 44, and they come back at 49. So 4 or 5 years they were absent. And this is a very important period in Japanese history in the sense that nobody could predict what would happen, how the war would end. Even the Americans couldn't predict in 1945. And the momentous changes after Japan surrendered, with the US occupation coming to Japan, the Tokyo trial. Yes, the emperor isn't tried, but Japan is completely reoriented as a nation. And the Americans do everything they can to turn Japan into an ally from yesterday's enemy that they bombed. I'm not just talking about atomic bombings, which are more visible, more conspicuous, but I'm talking more about leveling the country. Pretty much almost every major city was completely leveled. I'm talking about conventional bombing. So we talk about in this country, it's more better known, partly maybe because of the British participation in the Allied bombing of Germany, for example. People know about the firebombing of Dresden, which estimates 18,000 to 25,000 civilian deaths. But few people know about the firebombing of Tokyo, which in one night, 100,000 civilians died in one night in March 1945. So we're talking about a nation that was completely leveled, and suddenly there's a massive change of course, and to bring Japan into the American security system, into the American alliance system in East Asia. And because of that change, and in the book, I use the analogy of time travel. So the Japanese who are coming back in 48, 49, they're not simply crossing geographical borders or national borders. They're crossing also borders between eras, because the Japan that they had left was a completely different Japan. It was the Empire of Japan. It was fighting with the Americans. That's why they're so angry, many of them, when they are greeted by American officials. That's why their hatred towards the Americans wasn't only because of the Soviets. Their hatred towards the Americans actually predated the propaganda that they received from the Soviets. So they didn't recognize Japan. They came back, and at the repatriation center, they were given aid money, or an amount of money that they would use to get themselves back up, if you like. And when they saw the amount, it was 3,000 yen. So one of them actually remembers, when I received 3,000 yen, I was really happy, because I thought, I'm going to buy a new house. So of course he's thinking in pre-war Japanese exchange rates, and he was completely unaware of the rampant inflation over the past few years. All he could buy was a pair of shoes for 3,000 yen. So it was nothing. So they were shocked, but their shock was not as bad as the Soviets had predicted, because the Soviets were pouring this propaganda into their ears that Japan is completely on its knees. It's now an American colony, that people are selling their children to buy rice, that Japan has now completely turned into a colony. So that in a way also helped them to drop their Marxist or Soviet allegiance more quickly.
Thank you, Sherzod. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm amazed in some ways that this topic is not better well known, and I'm sure your book will help fill that gap and spread the information. Thank you very much for speaking to us today.